Hello, everyone. As we step into this second module, we're going to talk a little bit about aging families. And I know there are a couple chapters in this module, but I want to remind you all, especially as we move towards guest lectures, that the lecture should complement your readings. So I will not all the time have a lecture for every single chapter, even though you're responsible for reading those chapters. My lectures are going to be based on a conversation that hopefully we're having about some of the aspects that are brought up in our chapters. So I wanted to clarify that because I know some students will start to look for a lecture per chapter, and for this online course, we're actually going to focus the lectures around what is important within all of the readings combined. So I just wanted to point that out to you. Again, we're going to, in chapter 1 in your textbook, looks at who are these aging families, and or in going back, does it look more like this definition, or is it kind of a combination of both? As we think about families and the types of families and how that impacts older age, we need to look at lifespan. We talked a little bit about that previously as lifespan has continued to grow, but we also want to know, where are older individuals in society? Your book points out these statistics, which pretty much hold true, and I want to always emphasize to you that when you're looking at statistics, especially in a textbook or even that those are written, we're typically about 5 years behind our statistics. So the U.S. Census Bureau every 10 years will do a very large census take, and a lot of people go through that documentation and pour through the elements to report the statistics appropriately, but it takes a while for some of these facts to rise to the top. But I would argue that this seems pretty clear, even if it was presented around 2005, 2007. Types of family in late life: 72% of older men are married, while only 42% of women are married. And again, you have to couple that with longevity and life expectancy. What we know is biologically, women typically tend to live longer than men, but that varies by race. So again, we want to be really sensitive about some of these statistics that we're throwing out. But in general, across races, we do see that men typically do have a shorter lifespan than women, and that 43% of women are typically widowed, and so they are living alone, or definitely not living with a partner. They may be living with older adults that live with a spouse, so that's 55% of older adults who live with a spouse in general. And then 1/3 of older adults live alone because they are widowed. And we do see different family situations. So as I mentioned above, 43% of women are widowed. They could, again, either live with adult children, or we also see new coupling happening, such as friends that maybe both lost a spouse that for financial reasons and also for companionship may choose to be roommates and reside in the same home. So there's a lot of different situations that come about. Your book talks about fictive kin and extended kin. And so because we've had these changes in mortality and fertility rates, and fertility rates are declining, especially in the US and in certain Asian countries as well. But those for lowering fertility rates have led to families having fewer members in those younger generations to really help with caregiving. And previously, as you thought of large families, there were more children being born in the family, and so there was more of a shared experience in taking care of older people that was shared among many people in the family. Whereas now we're seeing households of, if they do have children, maybe one child or two children. We're not seeing the larger numbers like the 6, 7, 8, up to 13 children in a household as we did in the early 20th century. So we are seeing caregivers being reflected as nieces. Your book identifies that in some cases where individuals hire home health aides to go in and take care of someone or be a companion at home, that almost turns into like a fictive kin type of experience. And you have these home health aides that really become essentially part of that older adult's family because they do know them so well. And we have step families and blended families that do reach out and are caring for each other in new ways that we haven't seen before. The one thing I always want to stress, and I feel it's important to note, are these effects of personal characteristics. So when we think specifically of race, class, gender, age, all of this, and we coin it as a term of intersectionality, has to do with definitely those family obligations. And families look different by race, by culture, and there are different norms and values in different cultures as it relates to taking care of people late in life. It is truly crucial for all of us as we're working within the field of gerontology to really consider the results that support intersectionality and an intersectionality approach with all demographic groups, typically exhibiting worse functional limitation trajectories than, for example, white men. So in the research, we can see that whereas white men have the lowest disability levels, typically at a baseline age, white women and racial and ethnic minority men had an intermediate disability levels, with Black and Hispanic women having the highest disability levels. So these health disparities remain stable with age, and we see that age and race and social class absolutely take a toll on health and will therefore impact caregiving. We do see among Black women that the trajectory of being disabled tends to accelerate. So we as a society really need to look and see what are we doing to ensure that we are taking care of older adults equally and making sure that the caregivers of those adults have equal access to health care, equal access to health. So we see very early life social origins and adult socioeconomic status, marital status, and health behaviors all play a part in the racial and ethnic disparities and functional limitations among men, but only partially explain the disparities among women. So we also want to look at life course capital, racial and ethnic groups which may have higher functional levels of limitations, and all of those aspects that could really impact how we care for our older adults. This is very crucial and important to look at. For my graduate students in the class, as you think ahead to your guest lectures and preparing potentially what looks like a topic around one issue. So one example I will give you is the module in which we're talking about caregiving for individuals who have dementia or Alzheimer's. I'd like you also to consider how the aspect of gender, race, age, and social class fit into the aspects of caregiving for that particular group. The aspect of male caregivers is really interesting and one that we're seeing evolve more in the research as it relates to some of the difficulties that men experience in caregiving as opposed to women. Similarly for adult children, if you look at a family that comes from a more Western ethnocentric type of evolution, so you have potentially a white family, it seems as though the strains on adult children are harder for those than other families who have this importance of shared decision making. And we see that in Hispanic families and within the African American community. So I invite all of my graduate students and even the undergraduate students who are some of those discussion leaders to really ask some of these questions and provide us with information about how education might impact caregiving, or how one's race, ethnicity, gender, income, their geographic location. We'll have a special topic devoted just to caregivers in rural areas, how that all really impacts the aspects of caregiving. And then finally, as we look at cultural diversity, we really need to understand those very unique differences that make caregiving different based upon where individuals call their orientation and the roles and the support that they give. So, for example, if there is a culture and there's a family that come from a culture where there is a female dominated household in comparison to a male dominated household, what does that look like if within the female dominated household you have the female who becomes ill, and all of a sudden there's an adult male child or potentially a spouse who is now making some of those decisions and needing to take the lead, whereas potentially the female had done so in the past? Or do we see in those dominant kind of households that it's not potentially the male spouse who would step up and make some of those decisions, but instead an adult child who is a female as well? So an adult daughter, or potentially even maybe the daughter-in-law, would trump the caregiving responsibilities in comparison to maybe a biological male because of their sexual orientation. And we also want to look at that cooperative style and the interaction between extended family members. There are cultures that do not have as open a relationship with extended family members as other cultures. And we need to identify those strengths in working with different cultures and how to really dial in to some of those aspects that may be important to that family based on their background, and use that to help them as well. For my graduate students, the supplemental readings this week are a little bit varied around this topic of family. And for my undergraduate students, I definitely invite you and feel that you would be interested in those articles that are posted. Those are the type of supplemental articles and information that I want you to bring forward in the discussions as we start them in Module 3. Our discussions in class should truly feel as though you're not just logging into a computer and you're responding the same way everyone else is. Yep, I agree, that looks great. But really giving your input and looking at the research and seeing what they have to say. And maybe if a classmate says something to you that sparks particular interest, you have the ability to go and look at that and reference that to provide more information. I'm always looking for students to provide more information to their classmates instead of just reading posts that simply agree with what always has been said. You will have a rubric for those discussions, so you'll be able to see where my grading will come from. And a lot of that does have to do with, again, bringing in new information, which is so important. That is the end of our lecture for this module. Again, I would really encourage you to fall back on those readings and really embrace the differences and the different nuances that all of them bring as it relates to how families have changed over the years and just how large of an impact families have as it relates to the strengths that they bring in from their own culture.